Step out of the truck, sir! Now! Officer Daniels barked, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. The rain hammered the rusted truck's roof as its broken taillight flickered weakly. The driver, an elderly man with trembling hands, hesitated. Daniels' instincts, honed over years of patrols, screamed that something wasn't right. The door creaked open, revealing the frail man, soaked to the bone and clutching the edge of the truck for support. "Officer, I'm sorry, I'll fix the light, I swear," the man stammered, his voice shaking. I needed to get there." "Where?" Daniels demanded, his tone sharp. "My wife, she's dying," the man whispered, his words barely audible over the rain. The day had started as a disaster for Officer Daniels. A rookie cop had botched a DUI stop, and Daniels had been called in to clean up the mess. The suspect had escaped, the paperwork was incomplete, and Daniels had spent hours dealing with angry supervisors. It wasn't the first time he'd been the department's fixer, and it was beginning to wear on him. By the time his shift resumed, his mood was as dark as the storm clouds gathering overhead. The rain made everything worse. Traffic was chaotic, drivers were impatient, and the radio buzzed with complaints. Daniels was known for his professionalism, but even he had his limits. The rookie had joked earlier that Daniels didn't have a heart, that he lived by the book and nothing more. Maybe they were right, Daniels thought bitterly as he patrolled the streets. He didn't get involved in people's sob stories. His job was to enforce the law, not fix lives. So when he spotted the beat-up truck swerving with its broken taillight, Daniels didn't hesitate. Another routine stop, another problem to solve. But as he stepped out into the rain, he had no idea this stop would be anything but routine. Henry's hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the truck. His clothes were soaked, his face pale and his voice barely audible over the rain. I have to get to her," he stammered. Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes, scanning the man for signs of intoxication. "Who's her, sir?" "My wife," Henry said, his voice cracking. "Martha. She's in hospice. I got the call earlier today. They said—" His voice faltered. "They said it's time." Daniels hesitated, his suspicions softening. He'd heard his share of excuses, but something about Henry felt different. The desperation in his voice was raw and unpolished, not the calculated tone of someone trying to manipulate him. Henry explained how he and Martha had been married for 50 years. "She's my whole world," he whispered. Cancer had taken hold of her quickly, leaving them with little time. For weeks she'd been in hospice, and now the end was near. Henry had jumped into his old truck without thinking, ignoring the broken taillight and the sputtering engine. "I just need to say goodbye," Henry said, his eyes filling with tears. "Please, officer, don't take this moment away from me." Daniels stood in the rain, torn. The rain poured relentlessly as Officer Daniels stood beside the frail man, the wail of passing cars blending with the storm. Every protocol Daniels had ever followed told him what he needed to do: impound the truck, issue a citation, and send Henry on his way. The truck was a safety hazard, and the rules were clear. But as he watched Henry standing there, shoulders hunched and shivering, Daniels couldn't bring himself to act. Henry's eyes weren't those of someone making excuses. They were eyes filled with desperation and love. Daniels thought back to the time he'd missed saying goodbye to his own father because of a late shift. That regret had stayed with him, a wound that never quite healed. Daniels took a deep breath. "Get back in the truck," he said firmly. Henry froze, confused. "What? Are you letting me go?" "I'm not letting you drive alone," Daniels clarified. "I'll follow you. We'll make sure you get there safely." Henry's face crumpled as relief washed over him. "Thank you," he whispered. Daniels watched as the old man climbed back into the battered truck, the engine sputtering to life. Some rules, Daniels thought, were worth bending. The truck's engine sputtered and groaned as it rolled down the wet road, barely managing to stay in motion. Officer Daniels followed closely in his patrol car, his headlights illuminating the swaying taillight on Henry's battered vehicle. Every time the truck wobbled or slowed, Daniel's heart jumped, fearing it might break down entirely. The rain grew heavier, turning the roads into a maze of slick hazards. Daniels radioed dispatch, alerting them that he was escorting a civilian in an emergency situation. He ignored the puzzled response, keeping his focus on the truck ahead. Inside the patrol car, Daniels couldn't stop thinking about the man he was helping. Henry's story replayed in his mind, striking a chord he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of the day he'd lost his father, how work had kept him away during his dad's final moments. Regret had followed him ever since, a shadow he couldn't escape. Henry didn't deserve that kind of pain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the truck pulled into the small hospice parking lot. Daniels quickly got out, rushing to help Henry, who was visibly shaking. They'd made it, but Daniels knew Henry's journey wasn't over yet. The hospice was quiet, the kind of silence that felt sacred. Nurses greeted Henry with gentle nods, their faces etched with understanding. They led him down a dim hallway, his frail frame leaning heavily on the wall for support. Officer Daniels followed a few steps behind, keeping his distance but staying close enough to help if needed. As they reached Martha's room, Henry paused at the door, his breath catching in his throat. A nurse placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She's been waiting for you," she said softly. Inside, Martha lay motionless, her breathing shallow, her once bright eyes now dim. But when Henry whispered her name, her eyelids fluttered open. A faint smile spread across her lips as she recognized the man who had been by her side for half a century. "I'm here, sweetheart," Henry said, his voice trembling. He took her hand, his own shaking as he held it. "I made it." Martha's lips moved faintly. "I knew you would," she whispered, her words barely audible. Daniels stood quietly by the door watching the scene unfold. The love between the two was palpable, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. This was a moment he'd never forget. The next morning, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the image of Henry and Martha from his mind. As he patrolled the streets, his thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet, powerful moment he'd witnessed in that hospice room. The love between the two was undeniable, and Daniels couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret for his own missed opportunities. He hadn't been there for his father when he needed him most. Determined to do something good, Daniels decided he would help Henry in any way he could. He knew the old truck would never make it much farther, and Henry had mentioned more than once that he couldn't afford the repairs. Without hesitation, Daniels called a local mechanic he trusted. He explained the situation and asked for a favor. The mechanic, a gruff man with a heart of gold, agreed to fix the truck free of charge. Daniels covered the cost out of his own pocket, something he'd never done before. The mechanic promised to give Henry a call when the repairs were finished. Later that day, Daniels visited Henry at the hospice to let him know the truck was in good hands. "You'll have it back soon," Daniels said. "I took care of it for you." Henry's eyes welled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Weeks passed before Officer Daniels received the letter. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, wedged between a stack of routine paperwork. The envelope was plain, with only Henry's name scrawled in messy handwriting on the front. Curiosity piqued, Daniels opened it carefully, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a simple, heartfelt letter. Henry had written to thank him for the kindness he'd shown during the most difficult time in his life. He spoke of how the small act of escorting him to the hospice had allowed him to be there for Martha in her final moments. "You gave me the chance to say goodbye," Henry wrote, "and for that I will never forget you." Enclosed was a photograph, an old faded image of Henry and Martha in their youth, standing side by side, smiling brightly under the summer sun. It was a love captured in time, the kind that lasted through decades of struggle and joy. Daniels felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the photo. This was a reminder of something more important than tickets, arrests, or traffic stops. The letter was a message he would carry with him. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness had the most profound impact. And in that moment, Daniels knew he'd never look at his job the same way again.